I think we should start our session, and be hopefully that Ravi will join us soon. So and we also had some introduction, so it's okay when he will join our session some minutes later. So okay, let's start our session on qualitative approaches in the field of basic income research. Our session is not going to be a series of presentations. It's going to be a roundtable with 3 discussants, if Ravi is joining us soon, and 2 chairs who might participate a little bit in the debate. Perhaps we can all participate in the debate because our group is not that big. My name is Manuel Franzmann. I'm one of the chairs. The other one is Hanna Ketterer. We both organized this roundtable. Let me introduce myself briefly. I'm working as a social scientist at the University of Kiel in northern Germany, and I am also a co-founder of the Basic Income Network in this country. My perspective on our topic is strongly influenced by the methodology of objective hermeneutics, a social science method for reconstructing the meaning of utterances, actions, and all kinds of expressions of human practice within their practical context. Why did we, Hanna and I, organize a roundtable on qualitative approaches in the field of basic income research? Well, the reason is that since the first pilots in the 60s and 70s in the US and Canada, empirical research on basic income has predominantly followed standardized quantifying approaches. There has been little qualitative research to do justice to the complex life practices of real people and to analyze these practices in an open way within their practical context, based on rich naturalistic data from exemplary cases. Even in the present, such research plays only a subordinate, supplementary, or anecdotal role, it seems to me at least, although it creates the best conditions for an adequate, differentiated understanding of reality. This is in no way to deny that the many quantitative studies make valuable contributions and that there are good scientific reasons for conducting them. Rather, the problem is that they are often associated with a misconception that numbers directly represent reality and do not require careful and sometimes complex interpretation. The problem is a naive view of quantitative methods, like it is, for example, expressed on the website of the NGO Give Directly, which conducts large randomized controlled trial studies, RCT. There you find the dubious claim that this statistical approach is the, quote, gold standard for evidence, quote. The fact that such unreflective positivism can cause problematic consequences was demonstrated by the example of the ongoing basic income pilot in Berlin, which is backed by the German Institute for Economic Research. The research director, the sociologist Jürgen Schupp, presented the scientific character of this RCT study at the beginning as if there were no serious differences between an RCT study in the natural sciences, for example, in pharmaceutical research, and in the social sciences. Therefore, he claimed that the study would directly show the effects of a UBI as it would later be introduced in society. However, this is a scientifically unserious claim. In a basic income experiment, unlike in pharmaceutical research, the reflexivity of the participants comes into play. They are aware of the artificial experimental setting and the limited duration. The experimental results must therefore always be interpreted in their context. They can subsequently be transferred to the different situation in which a UBI is permanently introduced into society. But again, this is interpretive work in which theories play a role as mediating links. It is therefore an illusion to believe that statistics from social experiments and pilots directly provide scientific evidence without complex interpretive work. Before Hanna will go to more detail about the focus of our roundtable, I would like to take this opportunity to bring to your attention an informal network that aims to provide a permanent space for interested people to exchange ideas about qualitative research on basic income. It's called UBI Lived Research Network. I will post the link in the chat right now.
Okay, then I continue here. I'm happy to see our third guest also amongst us. Ravi is here too. Against what Manuel has just sketched out as the state of the art that we see in the basic income research, the idea of this roundtable is to kick off exchange amongst qualitative basic income researchers. It is to create a space for the joint reflection on the potential of qualitative, particularly reconstructive approaches to the study of basic income, starting from the critical reflection of our very own research practices. By our very own, I'm intending the entire community of qualitative researchers, including Manuel and myself, and both our sociological work. Manuel has done, I'm speeding a bit up because we lost some minutes, and yeah, we want to have more time for the group discussion. Manuel has done research, amongst others, in the area of work and employment and unemployment, and recently increasingly also on education. In my PhD that I do at the University of Jena, I'm working on basic income by looking at already existing guaranteed livelihoods at the case of rentiers, where people that usually got a family inheritance they can live on, and a community which practices a shared economy model, which also provides basic incomes for each member. What we both share in common, Manuel and myself, is the single case method, where one person may well constitute, not in all cases, but one person may well constitute one case, and the use of hermeneutics, different variants of it, in the data analysis. To this roundtable today, we have invited three very fine scholars in the field of basic income: Ravi Gokani, Victoria Boelman, and Minseo. Each of them has been involved in a different pilot project or in the assessment of a policy program situated specifically in time and place. Our guests have been involved in the research design, the data collection, and the data analysis in the Barcelona BMINCAM project, the Ontario Basic Income pilot in Thunder Bay, which was prematurely cancelled, and the South Korean Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income program. Now, jointly today, we want to look at some of the issues and assumptions involved in the ways we produce knowledge on basic income, a real utopia that we can only observe indirectly. Never, however, so far, directly. To do this, we want to take a closer look at the studies our guests bring with them in terms of the methodologies that are employed, the research questions that are formulated, and the findings that are generated. What do we find on the basis of our theories and methods? What are our findings on? What do they mean, and how do they transfer to a genuine basic income society in which everyone, not just a few select, would have the right to a basic livelihood no matter what? We believe addressing these issues is fundamental if we want to progress in the science of basic income. And it's fundamental for both researchers on the quantitative and on the qualitative side, although I actually don't want to make this divide, but let's say researchers using both methods. For this reflexive engagement will improve our theorizations on basic income. And by that, I mean the explanatory accounts we give on the instrument's potential social and individual effects. But it will also improve our capacities to affect social change, because we will know a bit better what society is made up of and informed policymaking. This roundtable format is to enable a group discussion amongst our 3 guests and experts. And we, as moderators, we want to facilitate the exchange between the 3 of you. And we would really like you to be able to react to each other's points immediately when you feel you have something to add, you want to share some different experience or anything else. So as moderators, we just hope to be able to create a space where it's possible to take a critical, reflexive gaze back on our work, share and discuss delicate issues when we do basic income research. There will be time for the audience, which is small, but you will be able to raise a couple of questions towards the end of the group discussion. So roughly around 2:10 p.m. We'll have time for 90 minutes for this roundtable. It will last until 9:30 Korean time. And now we will start off with a short round of self-presentations by the order of Ravi, Victoria, and then Minseo. I'm delighted to give the floor to our experts. Ravi, I hand over to you. Yes.
Great. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, excellent. Sorry for being late. I got lost in the digital hallway and ended up in the Google universe waiting there for a little bit. But anyway, good to be part of this. Thank you to Manuel and Hanna for organizing and for the prefatory comments. I'm just going to make a brief statement about answering who I am, what kind of basic income research I've done, and my view toward basic income research, specifically qualitative basic income research and what it can do for us. Generally speaking, I am an associate professor in the School of Social Work at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada. I'm willing to bet that not a single person here has been there. And I'm willing to bet that probably more than half probably don't know where that is. And if you do, you probably know it because of your interest in the basic income. I would say I'm a mixed methods researcher, which is to say that I have quantitative training in my undergraduate, and then my master's and PhD work. I have qualitative training, and I have always been comfortable working in both, which means that I get heck from both sides, which means that I tend to upset the qualitative researchers and the quantitative researchers, depending on who I'm talking to about what. I confess to being the qualitative skeptic as a result here, and I've mentioned this to the panel organizers and others here. I'm probably more closely aligned with the objectivist or objectivism stance, but that's not to say that I am anti this or that. And if there's an opportunity to talk about that, then perhaps we could. In terms of the kind of research I have done on basic income, I did a qualitative study on the outcomes of the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, including its cancellation, which is it was prematurely canceled. I'm sure everybody in here knows that. I did a community-based research study, or at least a study that was qualitative, that borrowed community-based principles, along with an organization called the Kinawea Legal Clinic, which is a legal clinic in Thunder Bay that provided and still does provide legal support to individuals who are on social assistance programs. And so they helped communicate the message of the Ontario Basic Income Pilot. They helped onboard people who were on the 2 social assistance programs onto the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, and of course they helped people get back onto social assistance once the OBIP was canceled. Thunder Bay, as I said, was one of the 3 cities that served as a site of the Ontario Basic Income Pilot. So Kinawea Legal Clinic, and specifically one of the community organizers there named Angie Lynch, who unfortunately is no longer with us, had a series of questions about what the Ontario Basic Income Pilot did and what the impact of that cancellation was. And so we sought to ask 2 major questions. How did people experience the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, and how did they experience the cancellation of the Ontario Basic Income Pilots? In order to answer that, we employed a qualitative study. We did semi-structured interviews with 20 of the former recipients of the Ontario Basic Income Pilot and 13 key informants. we analyzed the data using something called thematic analysis, which is associated with Braun and Clark. There were 6 main themes, none of which would surprise, for instance, social inclusion improved, financial security improved, and so on. And then once the program was canceled, all of these things kind of reversed. The one unique finding that I would hazard to mention here is that the cancellation, because it was premature, seemed to have increased a sense of distrust in the government. So in terms of what qualitative basic income research can bring us, there's multiple ways you can answer the question. I've sought to answer this question in this way. In 2017, the provincial government in Canada conducted and published a preliminary baseline survey of potential basic income recipients. And then in 2018, they did an update, and this is available online. So I'm going to give you a couple of questions here from that baseline survey. Here's the first question. During the last 12 months, was there ever a time when you felt that you needed healthcare but did not receive it? Now I'll tell you the answer. It's about 37% of people in Thunder Bay answered yes. So 1 in 3 people said yes. In the last year I wanted to get healthcare, but I couldn't receive it. Here's the follow-up question on that survey. Thinking of the most recent time you felt this way, i.e. you needed healthcare but you couldn't get it, was one of the reasons you didn't get healthcare because of the cost? And here 76% of people in Thunder Bay said yes. In other words, in the last year, they needed to get healthcare, but they couldn't. And the reason they couldn't do that was because it cost money and they didn't have them. So now consider this, and I'm going to quote here. But the other good thing about basic income was up until being on the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, I hadn't and I could not get in to see a dentist. No dentists would accept me. They wouldn't accept me. As soon as they heard I was on ODSP, which is the Disability Support Program, it didn't matter. My sister-in-law loves her dentist, and she recommended her dentist. She says, I'll take you in. As soon as the dentist heard that I was on ODSP, she said, no, sorry. So I got a lot of dental work done when I was on the Ontario Basic Income Pilot. I got my teeth taken care of and my gums taken care of, and had a couple of teeth pulled. Or consider this. I made extensive plans to take care of my teeth, have my teeth removed, straightened, whatever. I have rotting teeth. I think I have gum disease is what the reality is, and that's why my teeth are rotting. Those two statements are from interviews from the qualitative study that I did. Consider another question from the baseline survey. Compared to 3 months ago, how would you rate your emotional problems, such as feeling anxious, depressed, or irritable now? And consider the potential responses. 1, much worse. 2, slightly worse. 3, about the same. 4, slightly better. 5, much better. And imagine what the responses would look like, right? 30% of people say 2, slightly worse. 40% of people say 1, much worse. And however you want to present that in graphical form or chart format, you can imagine. And then on the other hand, imagine a descriptive response to that question. Imagine how people in your all life, people who are not researchers, and I think I always think about this because of the community-based research, it doesn't allow you to not think about it. I think about how people in my life who are not researchers might respond to the 2 different sets of responses, i.e. on one hand, you have a chart with these bars and you have nice numbers. You might have a high N, 5,000 people, whatever. But on the other hand, you have only 1, 2, 3 responses, but they're rich and they're relatable. So I guess the first point I'm making here is really a kind of hypothetical question. Instead of what qualitative research might offer us, it's a question of what it might have offered us here in Ontario. What might have happened to the Ontario Basic Income Pilot had there been qualitative data in response to these questions? There aren't, right? There's 50 pages of survey data, but there isn't a kind of rich description of the way that people on social assistance live their lives before they went onto the basic income pilot. I would say largely in the public domain, there's just these kind of stereotypical understandings of how people live. Would a richer, more relatable description of lives of people on social assistance have changed some minds in the public or government about the value of basic income? And to be fair here, Hugh Seigel, who sadly recently passed, in 2016, in his discussion paper for the Liberal government that put into place the basic income pilot, recommended qualitative and quantitative data, recommended both types of data. But the question that I posed remains whether or not words are more relatable than numbers. And here's a rephrasing of that, or a corollary. Would voters, who are largely responsible for the policy, for the change in government that resulted in the policy change, would voters respond more empathetically if they read words as opposed to numbers? I think here.
Yep. Sorry to interrupt.
You want me to close up? Yep. Yeah. I'll be done in 2 seconds. I think here also studies that show how cognitive bias like framing can shift funding allocations to homeless shelters, and I can talk a little bit more about that. I'll close with a variant of the original question posed for this panel discussion. Does qualitative research provide a social and political understanding of the social and political nature of life outcomes like poverty, social assistance use, and so on, which perhaps numbers can't do as well?
Thank you. Then Victoria, it's your turn.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Victoria, and until last month, I was Director of Research at an organisation called the Young Foundation, which is sort of the UK's home for community research and social innovation. So we have a history dating back to the 50s of researching and developing and testing new approaches to social problems. And we led a lot of the early theoretical work around defining the field of social innovation, which at its time, minimum income, basic income was a social innovation. I think we've now reached the point where the number of trials and the state we're at now, it's no longer socially innovative, but it was back in its day. As an organization and as an individual, like Ravi, take a multidisciplinary approach. But I think fundamentally we believe that, particularly in the UK, but globally as well, I think policy making really traditionally undervalues qualitative and participatory research evidence. And as was mentioned earlier, there's this real privileging of experimental or quasi-experimental and quantitative methods and data. And, you know, this has definitely been the case with basic and minimum income trials. I was involved with the 2017 Barcelona minimum income experiment. And prior to that, the vast majority of trials had little or no qualitative evaluation really embedded in throughout the entire trial process. And that was really leaving those huge gaps in understanding how and why people responded to trials as they did. What does that quantitative data really mean? As Ravi was just saying, you've got those scores, but what does that actually mean in the terms of how it's changed people's lives? It also leaves studies exposed to missing unanticipated effects and also to missing out on really important process learnings about how we do these types of trials. And I'll come back to talk about that a little bit more in a minute, because I think it's really important. It's also quite ironic because, as just been mentioned, although policymakers tend to privilege quant data in their analyses, we know that what often sways people and what often sways politicians who hold the power to implement or not, or to cancel these programs at whim almost, is usually actually real life stories. They want to know that the money that they're investing is making a meaningful difference, that it's something that sways hearts and minds, that sways voters, that's actually kind of really changing the lives of people. And that's what you get from qualitative research. So it's kind of a real tension around sort of what makes decisions and what influences policy making in the longer term. So as I said, we were involved as a partner in the evaluation of the Barcelona basic income pilot, which was called Beam Income. And the qualitative sat alongside the typical economic analysis, the analysis of the administrative data relating to the program. There was control group analysis. There was a large array of surveying of households involved in the pilot. But the qualitative was a core component that sat alongside that and ran for the entire duration of the trial. And at the time, that kind of suite of evaluative methods was one of the most comprehensive evaluations that had ever been undertaken of a public policy in Spain. And so beam income was about testing the efficacy and the effectiveness of combining a form of passive economic aid, i.e. the minimum income payment, alongside active social policies. And it took place across 10 neighborhoods in a district of Barcelona, which has high levels of economic deprivation, relatively high levels of unemployment, and a kind of host of kind of social issues. Is what that area was known for. The minimum income was provided to around 915 households, and they were randomly selected from eligible applicants in those areas. And then they had a control group as well. But the trial was really complex. So there were many different versions of trial arms to which people could be allocated. So some people received their income conditionally on their participation in these active social policies. Others received it unconditionally. Some people's income was capped, other people's income wasn't capped. So there was quite a range of experiences happening within those communities according to which trial arm people were allocated to or not. And so, for example, some people were allocated to a vocational training program with employment at the end of it. Other people were allocated to a social economy project, which tried to help people create cooperative and social and kind of solidarity community and community interest companies and projects. Others were put into a community activation strand. So they were kind of participating in projects to help local organizations, local community associations and charities. And then finally, there was a terribly unsuccessful strand, which was a housing renovation policy, which was designed to help households renovate their homes to make a room available for renting to help increase their income. But only 10 households agreed to partake in that particular strand for lots of reasons that were uncovered by the qualitative research. It also had payments. Some parts of people's payments were being made in a local currency. So rather than receiving all of their minimum income payment in euros, about half of participants for about half of the trial period received 25% of their payment in the form of a digital currency that could be spent in certain local shops and with certain local services. So it was really, really complex. And so our qualitative research was actually enormous. It was of a scale which kind of nudges it almost towards being quantitative. So we worked in depth in 3 neighborhoods. We followed 35 households over time. So we did ethnographic home visits with them at the beginning, at the midpoint, and towards the end of the trial period. We did in-depth interviews with another 155 participants once through the course of this. And then we had 52 people take part in a most significant change participatory video process. So we were speaking to quite a significant proportion of the 915 households at least once over this period. And we also adopted a research approach which was sort of in line with the ethos of the pilot. I wouldn't go so far to say it was participatory, but we had local researchers who were recruited, and some of those came through local employment schemes to support young people into work themselves. And inevitably, we learned a lot. We learned all the things that you would expect us to learn that support and explain and expand upon the quantitative research about how people responded to the income, how they made their financial choices during this period, how it changed their attitudes or not towards employment, health, well-being, family dynamics, community dynamics. But it also told us a critical amount about how these trials work, and ended up providing an element of process evaluation that, to be honest, we hadn't really anticipated at the outset. And we how to implement and deliver this kind of minimum income trial. And I think, and it would be interesting to talk about it in the context of the Ottawa case as well, but for me, it's raised some really important ethical questions about what do we do when these trials end? How well are we supporting participants to prepare for a change? behavioral science tells us that actually to have something and have something taken away is sometimes worse than to not have it in the first place. And actually that's what we're doing to a lot of participants on these trials. The lottery kind of nature that people experienced of which trial arm they were allocated to in Barcelona also caused some tensions locally and some confusion. And so there were a whole range of ethical issues that I think it threw up that we would never have uncovered if it hadn't been for this quite deep qualitative process that we undertook. So yeah, I'm going to hand over now. I feel like I've taken my time, but I think there's some really interesting things to unpick through this conversation.
Great, thanks, Minseo.
I prepared the small slides, so let me share it little by little. So my name is Minseo. I'm studying sociology. I'm a PhD student in the University of Wisconsin-Madison in US. And the research I participated in is research on this policy called Gyeonggi Youth Basic Income, GYBI. So Gyeonggi province is a metropolitan area surrounding Seoul with large youth population. And GYBI is roughly $200 of cash transfer in local currency per season, meaning for 3 months, to local youth turned 24, meaning they are only getting this money for 1 year. And if you see the image here, it is a image of a birthday cake celebrating that their birthday when they turn 24. So it says that they are getting this money. So congratulations that you got 24 and you're getting this money. And most of the research funded by government institute for this policy was trying to measure whether the expected policy effect was really taking place, such as mental well-being improvement or improvement of economic security, or whether they are more actively participating in job seeking, happiness, and so on. And this was largely funded by Gyeonggi Institute, the government-funded institute. And this is the typical policy report produced mostly by quantitative scholars working in this area. They're analyzing policy effects and they are comparing ex ante and ex post surveys, the typical quantitative approach. When I became part of this research team, I was invited with the other cultural anthropologists and qualitative social work scholars. And in our first meeting, because we were summoned as a qualitative researcher, we tried to distinguish our research goal from the conventional approaches that was mainly taken by policy architects. First of which was political goals of forwarding basic income. They were largely celebrating the virtue of the policy, sharing these, heartwarming stories of how this money helped those recipients, or they are trying to debunk the negative stereotypes surrounding the recipients of the basic income, such as lazy surfer. If they get money, they wouldn't go to, seek their jobs, or they will stop working. That kind of myth. They try to debunk this negative stereotype. Other policy-driven research was motivated by administrative interest in policy, and they tried to measure the efficacy of the policy based on, in our thought, very fixed criteria, whether the policy was effective or not for fulfilling A, B, C, and D. We tried to do something different from that. And instead of starting from the expected goals or intention of the policy architects, we tried to focus more on those recipients' side. Our first question was, how do recipients interpret the social meaning of basic income? We are drawing this approach from the economic sociologist Viviana Zelai's work, her work on social meaning of money, focusing on how people, not only recipients, welfare recipients, but how people in general try to earmark the different meaning of money they get through various routes in their social life, such as if they earn the money, if they win the prize, if they borrow the money from someone else, that all shape how they attribute meaning to each kind of money. So we were borrowing from, largely drawing from Zelai's approach. We tried to focus on the distinctive meaning making attached to basic income compared to other social provision that is not basic income. At the same time, this means that their usage of this money, basic income, as named by government, was spent on very specific uses that they think is legitimate for basic income. A second question we raised was, what do they make of their recipient status? Why do they think they are getting this money, which is the money that is not given to other, age range of the population? Because this policy, GYBI, started as a very small scale, meaning the local government didn't want to start this policy for every single youth population from the very start. They tried to see it, whether it is really making specific effect that they were trying to expect. So that was our first question. Second question was, what do they make of their moral deservingness? What kind of moral qualification they think is supporting their recipient status of basic income? That was our motivation for those questions. And this is the article that we produced together, titled "The Aspiration for Security and the Will to Contribute." As you can see from here, we were trying to focus on narratives of youth basic income project in Gyeonggi-do, South Korea, meaning we tried to delve into the very narrative produced and provided by young recipients. This is not actually about the effect of basic income policy per se, but it focuses more on the life of those young recipients who are changing to an extent after they started to get this basic income. So our key two findings was as follows. First one, although basic income advocates and scholars tried to legitimize basic income as an unconditional right, most of them were perceiving this money as a Mosian gift or debt to be reciprocated. Second, this is also in stark contrast to basic income discourse discussed in academia. Even though basic income advocates tried to frame or legitimize basic income as post-work money or some money that is decommodifying their employer status, they try to frame themselves, understand themselves as future worker, as qualified status or categorical specificity of youth that is legitimizing their reception of this basic income. So this was their key ground for deserving this. So our research tried to illuminate not the basic income effect per se, but rather the unfulfilled aspiration for security and individualized will to contribute. So for the closing, I think one lesson I learned from this research is that qualitative research can do something more than just verifying the expected effect as envisaged by policy architects or administrative officials. Rather, we could uncover the unexpected meaning making of the recipients after they get this money. Secondly, rather than just measuring whether the policy goals were fulfilled or not, maybe we could also explore the unexpected lived experience of those recipients. And I also want to add that qualitative research conducted in this fashion could also have a lot of policy implication because it uncovers recipients' needs that are not expected or hypothesized in the survey questionnaire before they conduct this kind of in-depth interview or FGI as we did in this research. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you for these three presentations. Now we'll try to pick up some of the issues that you pointed out to. Manuel, do you want to have a start?
Yeah, I find it interesting to have a conversation about findings where you have the impression that they are related to the qualitative research, where you have the impression that this specific finding wouldn't have been discovered without your qualitative approach. Are there some very interesting and important findings? Of course, I know that it's difficult to pick up one, but perhaps it's interesting for all of us to hear whether there are findings and very interesting findings where you have the impression that they are connected to the methodological procedures. I don't know if someone of you want to start, be the first. Ravi.
Yeah, sure. One thing I could say is that if I didn't do a qualitative study and have a semi-structured conversation with participants, I would not have known some of the political context of people's comments, the frustration with the government, the frustration with Doug Ford. I haven't included that in any presentation or public works. There's a lot of profanity in it, but there's a deep-seated frustration with political authority and political parties in Canada that served as a kind of context for understanding some of the more I don't want to say obvious, but intuitive findings about basic income research. I don't think that would have, if you're asking questions on a Likert scale, you're not going to get that kind of context, which is what I had received.
Thank you. Victoria?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things I would say. There were some small things that you would pick up that wouldn't have come through in a survey. So, for example, we found a handful of instances, not many, but where women who had been the recipient of the income payment in the household had really used that to emancipate themselves. Some of them had left abusive relationships and been able to leave the home, for example, which had never been a sort of possibility for them in how things were before. And that's not the kind of thing you're either likely to ask in a survey or that might be captured in a survey. And it's not dozens and dozens of people, but nonetheless, it's an important insight to some of the impacts it can have. But I think more fundamentally, it highlighted some things that for me show the difference between how people behave in a trial versus how they might behave if this was a long-term, actually common policy. So, for example, in Barcelona, people still very much saw the basic income payment as a form of welfare and a form of benefit. And so it still felt quite stigmatizing to them. It wasn't universal enough to not be stigmatizing. That then fed into people's attitudes to work to some extent, because they didn't feel that, receiving that income was kind of parity with the esteem that they would get from going to work. And then, of course, they knew that they were only getting it for 18 months or so. And so they were making different choices than they would have done if they'd known that this was a long-term basic income than if it would have been an 18-month kind of temporary uplift in their income. And I think that kind of context and understanding, particularly about how people behave differently because they know it's a fixed-term pilot, is really important, because people do behave differently. And so we have to accept that actually some of that quant data that we gather isn't really reflective of how people would respond in the long term if this was guaranteed as a kind of, lifetime basic income for all citizens. And so for me, that was kind of like one of the key things we picked up through the qual that wouldn't have come up otherwise.
Shall I?
If you like, go ahead.
Yeah, so just like Victoria's finding, one thing I found through qualitative research was how the recipients perceive this meaning of this money, even though, policy circle and public debate frame the basic income as something that is not welfare. All of those recipients I met were much more familiar with the word of welfare, right, rather than like unconditional right or entitlement or dividend or something like that. So that was one thing I found. And in addition to that, one thing that really stood out for me was this something that I want to name as the third category of consumption. In the public debate, most of the basic income opponents try to criticize basic income, that the money will be spent on, drinking alcohol or other unnecessary luxurious goods, something like that. Whereas the proponents tend to advocate basic income as something that would be spent on something that they really need, such as like, basic livelihoods goods, such as like bread, rice, or something. But when I asked them to take a photo of the objects that they bought using this basic income money, the consumption that they thought are most meaningful, most of them brought something that is not falling into either luxury goods category or the basic livelihoods category. The category that I found was something that I want to label tentatively as the meaningful consumption goods. And that the example of that was like, you know, glasses like this. That is something that they really need, but something that could be improved by using more money, or some kind of like books that they could keep and not just consume, but that they enjoy their mental growth. So this kind of a third category of consumption is what I found that I think I couldn't find through only quantitative research as well.
I would like to share what I just observed in your answers, which or not only in the answers, but already in the opening statements, which really struck me, which was that actually both Ravi and Victoria, you said, well, we found all the things that you would expect us to learn, or Ravi, you didn't even list all the 7 thematic findings that you got, but yeah, you know, social inclusion was better, financial security, and so on. And now you were really looking, well, what else did I find, which was innovative, also is sparked by Manuel's question, right? But I really wonder which kind of questions we actually need to raise, if we actually need to have certain pilots, because what we're working on is poverty, right? And we have also a huge body of knowledge on certain phenomena already, and sometimes we expect to get some sort of new insight from a 2-month study. Or really, what do we expect to get? So this is a bit, I'm really wondering about the value of this kind of research. This is one thing, and the other maybe for later, because I can connect quite well to your research, Minseo, I think, with my own research. Which would be the other side is, what do we learn about this society, right? And the norms and values that are reigning in this society. And I think this is also quite important then for the question, would a UBI be able to change in that setup, and what not, and or how could we imagine social change? I think we're also missing a theory of social change here. So now I brought already 2 things that I think are important. Maybe you want to react to one of these. Yeah, Victoria.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good provocation. I think sometimes we do need to keep sort of finding similar things over and over again, because all of these trials are slightly different. They're all in different cultural contexts. They're all in slightly different political contexts. And I think, you know, sometimes you need to build the body of evidence that says sort of what Minseo is just saying, that actually most people aren't out there blasting all the cash on drink and drugs, and kind of understand how people do use it. So there is sometimes benefit in just kind of growing that evidence base in different contexts and different situations. But I think it is then also understanding the nuance of actually how does it play out in these different types of implementation of trial. You know, the difference between the target group, the amount of money, and the way it was being implemented between Korea and Barcelona is vast. And so understanding how different the way in which a basic income is presented to people and who it's given to, and the narrative that surrounds it, I think is how we can then start to use qualitative research to explore how people respond to it. So if it's presented as a gift to everybody who's turning 24 versus it's a minimum income payment for people in very poor households in one part of a city, you know, that narrative around what is this basic income is very different. And so understanding that, to me, is one of the big values of qualitative.
I think Ravi was first.
Yeah, that's an interesting like summary, Hannah. I appreciate that. I think the approach that I took to responding to the questions for the panel was looking at qualitative research from a practical or a pragmatic lens. There are, you know, whether or not you, and I realize in conversation with Manuel and others that the as you know, apropos of qualitative research, context matters. Canada is a very different place than Germany, let's say, or South Korea. Here, the observation that I made was that there was a lot of misunderstanding, which I think comes through in the comments by Minseo and Victoria among the public about what a basic income was. And it was registered through the kind of simple heuristic of a social assistant or a handout or giving money away and all these kinds of things. So regardless of like whether or not you are, wherever you are on that question of whether or not we need more pilots or more research, there are people that I know that are on the side that would point out, for instance, that we don't know, in Canada, what a basic income would look like if there weren't term limits. And that's like an important, policy question is what happens when the basic income is, permanent, as opposed to 3 years, because the behavioral observations of people's behaviors that we made were contingent upon the 3-year kind of timeline. But regardless of where you are with that, there is a real kind of obstacle, and that obstacle is public understanding. And so the question that I ask is whether or not words are more useful than numbers. Whether the public probably doesn't know what an RCT is, but they know what it means to go buy groceries, right? They probably don't know what a p-value is, but they understand what it means to balance a household budget and things of that sort. So there's a practical value to qualitative research, and I think that's the element that I kind of want to point out, pull out of what you've pulled out, Hanna, which is that that's the approach that I've taken, is that if in order to get the public to understand people's experiences, the people who are the bottom 10%, let's say, or the bottom quintile in Canada, I certainly think that words offer a more robust means to meaning than numbers for the average person. And to the extent that it does, it's a window into the lives of people that a simple number RCT just cannot. I just don't think that it can do that.
Building on what just Ravi mentioned, I think thinking of the time horizon or the limited time horizon of the trials is really important, because RCT people tend to envisage the social world as something that is like pasteurized social experiment, social laboratory, where we could observe those behavior change after the certain treatment is given, right? Whereas qualitative researcher could explore, if I can borrow Hanna's second points that she used, the expression, I think we can distinguish those two types of basic research. One thing is, the first one is studying basic income or studying the effect of basic income itself. The second thing is studying through basic income, meaning studying something that is not basic income, like cultural landscape or people's needs or people's cultural recognition of like what the social provision must be or must do. So maybe studying basic income versus studying through basic income would be, I think, one dichotomy that we can come up with in order to specify the realm of the basic research that couldn't be done by only quantitative research. Yeah.
Well, one thing, Ravi, I would like to add to your argumentation is that my impression from the research I've done within a project of the German unemployment agency, or the institute, the research institute of this unemployment agency, was a implementation research of a specific assistance program for long-term unemployed, and then we had a conference with many experts in the field, but not experts at the universities, but experts in the social insurance agencies, in the unemployment agencies, and so on. All people who know to read statistics, and many of them studied social sciences and so on. And also for them, I had the impression the presentation of some cases, could have a strong effect of evidence, because we discovered some contradictions in the implementation process. Victoria, your interesting report about the beam income contradictions was very interesting for me too, because I had to think of my own research in this regard at the implementation process. And my experience was at this conference that to present the people not statistics about the effectiveness of the program, but to present only one case who shows a major contradiction of the design of this implementation process could have a very, very strong evidence effect, yeah, and also for the experts, yeah. Okay. I think we have only some minutes and we can open the room for additional participants. But there's one thing I want to refer to. Ravi, we also discussed this in an earlier meeting. You mentioned the notion objectivism, and I think it's perhaps interesting to discuss a little bit about that. I would be interested to hear of the other discussants in our meeting too. What do you think qualitative approaches are valuable for to grasp the interpretations of the recipients, or also to get a more objective impression of their life practice? Do you make a distinction between this, or do you think it's valuable in both dimensions? And perhaps Ravi, you elaborate a little bit more on that, because I'm not sure what you're thinking about this question.
Yeah, sure. This is a very fun area of reading that's associated with my professional life, but I'm not a philosopher of science, so I have to just put that out there right off the hop. So maybe I'll connect it to something that I'd said earlier, right? Like the practical, pragmatic value of qualitative research, whether or not the public, whether or not, a qualitative description of somebody's lived experience holds more sway over the public mind, in the same way that RCTs might hold sway over policy wonks. One of the challenges to basic income, I think, might be that as a policy, we know that it has an activist base. There are organizations across the world and Canada that are devoted to saying basic income is what we need now, basic income now. Sometimes it's even presented as a kind of panacea for a future without jobs and all this kind of stuff. And there's all kinds of criticisms that you can make on both sides of that. But it does seem to be the case that qualitative research has a closer proximity to activism. And activism is, by definition, pointing in a certain direction. In other words, it's making normative claims about the world, saying that the world ought to be this way. And the kind of objectivist stance, at least in theory, would be that we're making positive claims about the world, that this is the way the world is, right? Now, if we move away from kind of a simple dichotomy of this kind of pure, Platonic idea of objectivism and subjectivism, then there's a little bit of nuance there. The question I ask myself with respect to this particular dimension of qualitative research in basic income, i.e. its practical use in conveying to the public the lived experience of the people who would benefit most, is whether or not the normative dimension or the proximity between qualitative research and activism would undermine the pragmatic or practical value of conveying to the public that there might be some value in this particular policy. So, the one question I would maybe just put out there, and I'll just close up there, I have here, would a public respond more favorably to a qualitative study that describes and presents the experiences of people in poverty, however flawed that might be from the vantage point of different paradigms, or would it respond more favorably to a qualitative study that politicizes, theorizes, problematizes the intersectional experience of neurodivergent people on social assistance living in low-income neighborhoods? Now, I've constructed those two sentences intentionally to kind of be one being on the objective side and the other one being more theory-laden. And then the question is whether or not they would respond better to a positive statement versus a normative statement from researchers. And I think that's open to question, but that's one of the issues with qualitative research that I see, is that there is a normative dimension to it. And people say quantitative has a normative dimension as well, but it's more overt, and it's more people will say, like, this is what we're doing, right? So, and so that's hopefully that, Manuel, that connects this question of objectivism with my previous point about the potential practical value of qualitative research and moving to the public forward and understanding people's lived experiences.
Anyone who want to respond to that? Or
hopefully I made sense. I'm not sure if I.
Yeah, I don't want to reply because it's very. I understand all of your arguments. Hanna, should we open our debate?
Yeah,
yeah,
sure.
Okay.
There are 2-3 people who are very welcome to. But actually, I would take in Reinhard Hu's statement because I've just the last one. I've just read it and it also works. I just want to add one thing which wasn't said yet on qualitative research, and I think it's important because I actually do think from a methodological standpoint, it's only by qualitative methods that we can discover mechanisms, social mechanisms that are the causes of the findings that we get. So the causes of the empirical observations that we make, be it when we assess the program, or be it a pilot, or be it any other qualitative study. So because this is the big difference. Correlations do not tell us what is the cause and what is the effect. And we can only do that with the kinds of studies in the research design that we are doing. And I think if it's really about explaining possible effects of a UBI or any other policy, we need to look at these. So this is why it's methodologically extremely important. And I think many quantitative researchers are not aware and do not reflexively take this into account. And the other thing that I think, which is what we always get, including myself, is that we will always get these contradictions between what basic income is being justified in the basic income discourse. Although I would also say there are very many different justifications of basic income depending on where you stand in the political spectrum. But yeah, we're more on the progressive left side. You have the post-war utopia, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the reality, the experiences of those people that we talk to that sharply oppose, actually, in terms of ethics, how they look upon themselves, on others, and on how they think they should live. And I think this is important for us to take up. There's a huge discrepancy, and I think we should rather ask ourselves, what do we need to learn in society to be able to take on some of these proposals, the ideas of how we could be living alternatively put forth by basic income. I think this is extremely important, and I think there are always some milieus and groups in society who are more, who are more prone towards the idea. But you cannot go out and there's no just one strategy to just convince people that it's the better idea. I think we need to deeply unlearn actually what Bourdieu calls the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu solidary economic beliefs, which is really deeply incorporated. And one of them is, this is what my study brings to the fore, is really that we also think we have to earn our living by our own wage labor. It's sort of that we are able to make our way through the world also by by getting the financial means by ourselves. So this also probably something that has been also pushed forward by neoliberalism. It has not always been like this. This is very important, but these are the kind of doxical also power mechanisms that we have also that are actually reproducing society. And I think we need to get at these solidary beliefs, otherwise we will not get any utopia in form of any concrete policy. So the question really for me is how real basic income, real freedom for all, how can basic income really bring this kind of freedom?
Maybe it would be a direct response to what Hanna mentioned, but continuing on the conversation that you just provided regarding what kind of political hope or empowerment that basic income research could bring in the age of neoliberalism and the political age that doesn't seem to have other outside of this capitalism. I think basic income research that we all conducted in our own country could be taken as some kind of exploration of borrowing Michel Foucault's expression, heterotopia. Heterotopia, according to Foucault, is a localized utopia, meaning it is an exceptional state of utopia that is only partially, and suddenly, it's kind of it exists only for a short time in a very, limited space. But even though, basic income trials are very short-lived and it doesn't, continue forever, as Ravi made point before, I think, these surprising and even miraculous, episodes and storytelling that we can come up with while we interview those people can certainly broaden our political imagination about how people can change their behavior if they are, provided specific amount of money regularly and so on. So it wouldn't be so much appealing for the scientists per se only, but it would, I think, politically empower and embroaden ourselves to think about the other ways of organizing our distribution and economic life at the same time.
Ravi, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment, and then I'm going to respond to, I believe, Reinhard Hess's question here in the chat. I think Hanna, that you had kind of alluded to. It is interesting to hear basic income as a potential response to neoliberalism, given that Milton Friedman was one of the kind of early supporters of basic income, and his arguments were different than the arguments that exist today. His was about economic efficiency, privileging economic efficiency and autonomy and freedom. This is a more efficient way of addressing issues of poverty, and that was perhaps the value that he had held higher than any of the values that maybe are more predominant today in the kind of neoliberal era, or the tail end of it, where there is perhaps a over and above individual freedom, autonomy, and economic efficiency. There's a kind of set of a pattern of neoconservative values that might be a little bit different. I think it's also interesting that some of the proponents of basic income in the United States in particular are wildly wealthy individuals like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. And that always makes me a little bit uncomfortable when we talk about basic income as a potential solution for the problems of neoliberalism. The one interesting comment that I heard at the World Economic Forum online, I wasn't there, Michael Sandel at Harvard said that his fear about a basic income and the rationale or the justification of the context provided by Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and this kind of group of people was that it could be construed as a kind of side payment for people to just kind of get out of the way if you weren't able to engage in the productive work of society. And so there is a kind of area there where we could look at basic income as not as a kind of threat to this idea that we ought to work for our own keep, but as a potential way for a future society where you could you would have a dichotomy or split between people who are allowed or permitted to work for their own, and then those who are not allowed or permitted to work to just take a basic income and kind of do what they do. So here's Reinhardt. Reinhardt has this question that I found really interesting. In this case, do we really need BI research in order to influence policymaking, or shall we rather state that BI is a normative issue and we need to convince the wider public to demand BI now? I think that's interesting. I would say that I think in order for us to have the conversation, the normative conversation about the values, I think there has to be a foundation of positive statements. In other words, in order to talk about what ought to be with basic income, I think we need to have a trustworthy foundation of what is. And I'm not sure in Canada we have that, because the government canceled the basic income pilot. So we don't have an evidence base, with respect to that pilot. Even the Mincome program in the 70s was run for 5 years and then abandoned for 30 years before anybody looked at the data. So I think those two things are connected. I think, at least for the general public, I think those who are social science researchers, I think they would respond differently. But again, I'm taking a practical lens here. For the average person, mentioning basic income and talking about what ought to be done about poverty, social assistance, all these kinds of issues, I think assumes an understanding in their mind, a set of positive statements that would need to be responded to, I think, first before we can meaningfully engage. Otherwise, I think the engagement will be between researchers and policy wonks who have a different understanding or a different set of positive statements about what actually is, and a public that may not know about adverse childhood experiences or all the kinds of things that come along that are associated with basic income and poverty. So hopefully that responds to your question, Reinhardt, which I think was interesting. Maybe somebody disagrees with me, I don't know.
Well, one point I find really interesting, and it's at the same time, I think, a very fundamental question. It was tackled in the research paper or on your report, Victoria, too. And I find there the interesting expression, mental bandwidth, from I think it's a notion that it is used in psychology. Yeah, am I right? Yeah, and because this I think points to this somewhat structural dimensions of a life with basic income, or at least an unconditional basic income. And it would be very interesting to have more research on the long-term transformative effects of a UBI. And I think the notion of mental bandwidth is a notion that gives us an impression what's the structural connection and the mechanism and dynamics that are put in place when we have a universal basic income in a long-term perspective. And we cannot see in these very short experiments and pilots these long-term effects. But I think these long-term effects in transforming our lives, these are somewhat the most interesting dimensions I can see with it. But how we can push in this direction to have more research on that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's something for me as well about, that positioning on what we're saying about a universal basic income. And is it a solution to poverty, or is it a mechanism which is designed to be truly universal and shift our relationship with work and the way that we operate as a society on a far more fundamental level? And I think, people in different parts of the world still talk about them and see them as doing different jobs, I think. And I think when we talk about the sort of the poverty alleviation side of them, whilst of course that's hugely important, I think it's a challenge to public acceptance in a lot of parts of the world. Unfortunately, there's there's some research came out in the UK recently where just even public acceptance of a minimum standard of basic welfare to enable people to frankly pay for a roof over their head and some electricity was frighteningly low. So kind of framing it as an income to tackle poverty probably is not the narrative and the language which will necessarily get the greatest level of public acceptance. But then I think if you're thinking about it from the other perspective, you're absolutely right. We need that much longer term study and trialing of these things to see how they do shift. Because what we were seeing in Spain was, yes, absolutely, some people were thinking very much about it as a knowing that it was time limited, but actually by taking away much of the day-to-day stress and that kind of additional labor that you do because you're poor, because you have to go to 7 different shops to get the cheapest products, because you can't just order all your food online from the near, one supermarket and have someone deliver it to your door because you're working so many hours, etc., etc. If you take away that, it gives people time and that mental bandwidth. You don't have time to think about your future, your education, your training, your kind of prospects, what you might want out of life, if literally your waking hours are fully occupied with just surviving. And it's that kind of scarcity kind of line of research and thinking that comes into that. And so actually we don't really know what will happen if you give people a little bit longer to adapt to not literally living in a kind of survivalist situation. And so I think there's something really important about the time over which we allow these things to run and to evolve and to learn from them, alongside their kind of time limited nature and the way that interacts. But I think that's really important.
I think this is a dimension where other studies, not only the studies about ongoing basic income experiments or pilots or so on, but also studies like the one Hanna is making about wealthy people. They have, or people who got some wealth and now their life is changing, are also interesting for the discussion about basic income. It's I think there are ways to study these effects, these transformative effects, and I let me add that I'm also very interested in the discussion, the debate in Great Britain in the interwar period, because I have the impression that the whole background of the UK, with its gentleman culture, for example, it's interesting because there are some experiences in your country beyond capitalism, aristocratic experiences that would be interesting to analyze and to discuss in another context, a context of universalism, where everybody could allow to live a life like a gentleman, for example, like the famous social policy expert Thomas H. Marshall has put forth. I think they imagined a society where everybody could be a gentleman because the basic necessities are there and you don't have to work. You can freely choose to. So I'm interested in the dynamics that would be put in place when you have these structural conditions. Everybody would have these structural conditions on a long-term basis. That would be interesting to analyze. Ravi.
Yeah, just to connect the discussion around, the normative dimension of basic income, and I connected it to the research, the normative dimension of qualitative research, and then of course you could critique quantitative research for being normative as well, but just not being honest about it. And connecting that to Victoria's point about time horizon, I think Minseo also mentioned it. One of the interesting things I've heard in Canada is researchers out of UBC from within economics did a review of basic income, and they'd suggested using a basic income, like making a permanent, using the model of a basic income to restructure disability support programs. And that would, the idea would be, twofold. One, that a lot of the kind of objection or resistance that people have in the public against a basic income kind of writ large, or UBI, is this notion of work and working for your own, your own stuff, your own welfare. And obviously that would be bypassed, if not somewhat, then perhaps completely, depending on how you structured the disability support program, because most people, including our conservative premier, has have gone on record saying, I would support people on disability for no questions asked. There's probably a critique of that you could make. But the other thing that it might do is it would allow people, it would allow the public, governments to test and study the impacts of basic income without having to threaten the project altogether. And one of the issues that came up in Canada was during the pandemic, the government issued something like a basic income called the CERB. You might have heard of the CERB. And a lot of people got really upset about that, and there was lots of examples of abuse, of that CERB. And in the end, the people who I think might have benefited most from the kind of the CERB serving as a kind of a social experiment that looked like a basic income are the people who are the most vulnerable, right? And now that discussion has kind of, it almost seems to have, CERB seems to have taken the kind of enthusiasm for a basic income with it, and people are thinking, I don't know if I want to do that again when I've seen what I've seen. So that normative dimension and the practical, the time horizon, that might be connected in a basic income with respect to disability.
Ravi's story about Canadian Turf is something that I also experienced in Korea, because during the pandemic, government issued like universal, they called a disaster fund for every single citizen. So it was kind of like once and for all, and not once and for all, just one-time basic income for everybody. So it was kind of like nature experiment, and just as Ravi mentioned, it raised a lot of like moral controversy over the character of this money, because this was the money that didn't have any association with the obligation to work, which is the primary way of earning income in our society, right? So I think this where Hanna's research on that rentier's economic life is also coming in, because be it rentier or be it basic income recipient, even though they look radically different from one another, one common thing that they have is that they are enjoying this money that is free of their wage labor, right? So any kind of like social research, maybe it could be a research on maybe like a person who won lottery, or a person who won inheritance from their parents. I remember who's that writer, Virginia Woolf. There was a verse from one of her writing saying that rather than the voting right given to women, what made me really free was the inheritance that she got from her aunt. I forgot which one of her relatives, but anyway, just adding one more episode that I learned from one of my interviewee in the research. The time that I was conducting interview for those basic income recipients was exactly the time of pandemic, and there was a stock market crash, and a lot of like people tried to go into the stock market because they thought that the market is really low and this is time to make money, because if they can buy this stock in a very low price. So most of them got really rich, not super rich, but and they also were experiencing another strand of money that was decoupled from wage labor. And my question for them was, how do you compare those two money, basic income and sort of like rentier dividend or unearned income that they earned by stock investment? And their answer was basic income didn't really mean anything for them because it was really small amount and it didn't last for long. The question of time horizon. So things like this illuminate not the efficacy of the basic income policy itself, but it can illuminate those ideological landscape that is shared and taken by so many members who would be potential recipients of basic income in the future society. So I think that's another thing that basic income research by qualitative approach can achieve and illuminate.
Yes, I can very much agree with the last point. And also looking at the time, now formally we are at the end of the session, and we thought we could have a little concluding round. So maybe each of us, and really, I mean, each of us, or who wants to, could say what he or she takes away from this session. We just maybe we can try to do that. Have one key message that we've learned. I'm sure we could continue now, and yeah, and collect research ideas and good things to look deeper at. But yeah, also looking at the time, I think it's good to have this concluding round. Is anyone here who wants to have a start?
I'm happy to just say thank you to the organizers, the panelists, and the people in the audience. It's fun to have discussions like this.
I also want to thank you very much because I didn't expect this, but this conversation is really encouraging and empowering because I can feel, you know, even though we are distant physically from one another, we are really sharing and, you know, experiencing the same sort of dynamics, both in politics and academics regarding this basic income. So thank you.
Yes, likewise. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Like all good researchers, I think I'm leaving with more questions than I came with. So I guess the answer is always more research is needed, right? Thank you.
Yeah, I thank you for the more kind of pragmatic implications of our qualitative research. This session also reminded me of how important it is that some real communities can have this experience, which is different to the normal day-to-day affairs. And because even if it's just a temporary pilot, it has some real effects, some changes, and that might change how we think of society and what we want from politics. And in this way, it's very important. And this was a thought that was recalled to me today. Yeah.
Yeah, and let me remind you at the end of our session to the UBI Lived Research Network that should be filled with life. At this moment, it's more an idea than a reality. But if you are also interested in the continuation of such conversations, send me an email or go to the website and put your mail address in the field for the newsletter, and perhaps it will have a nice start, and we can continue such conversations. It would be really, really nice to see. So, okay.
I will be bugging you, Manuel, about our epistemological journey that we're taking together. So
I will love it. I will love it. Okay, thank you so much for joining our discussion, and yeah, have a nice day or evening in South Korea. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.